Thank you very much. Hola. And it's such a great honor to be here in Puebla. And I just want to say one thing. A city and a state that has the intelligence and the wisdom to elect a musician as your governor. You have only one way to go, and that's up. That's foresight you don't see everywhere. Well, I came prepared to talk a bit about Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, and I certainly will. But I was also asked by a very important person this morning to talk a bit about Beethoven, and I'm delighted to do that as well. So I'm actually going to have two burning questions. The first one is, can music express, without words, can instrumental music express psychological and spiritual truths? And this might actually connect rather well to the last talk about happiness. I'm going to use as an example Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but in a cost-cutting move, the orchestra was canceled. So I'll try to play a little bit of it, but to demonstrate just how this works. But you know, the piece begins with the most famous four notes in music history. I think this must be the most famous beginning of any piece of music, right? Beethoven, it was a very unusual beginning. We're so used to it, you know. But it was very unusual, and people would ask him, what's that all about? Why did you start like that with those four notes? He said, it's fate. It's fate. It's fate knocking at the door, he said. It's fate knocking at the door. Well, think about how this piece begins, because after this very dramatic beginning, get my music glasses on here. The piece goes on with that same short, long. It's three more of them. That makes 6, 7, 8, 9. Finally, 2 extra notes. Right back again. And it goes down. Sometimes it goes up. Over and over. It's relentless. It's totally relentless. And this is sort of fate, being totally relentless in this very dramatic and almost angry way. You can't escape his fate. A little bit later in the same movement, there's now imagine I'm a French horn. I'm a French horn now. There's those 4, that's da-da-da-da again. And the strings come in with a gentle melody. Maybe fate is finally ignored. Don't we deserve a little respite from our fate? But actually, if you listen closely to that, next time you hear it with the orchestra, here's what you actually should hear. Not forgotten. It's in the background. Can't escape your fate. Your fate is always there. But what is this fate? Was it just general? We all have our fate. We all have our destiny. Beethoven actually meant something very specific. Whenever he referred to his fate, and he did it a lot in letters, conversations with people, he was always referring to the same thing. As many of you know, Beethoven went deaf. Deafness was his fate. And it was a long, slow process. It took 20 years from his first symptom of losing high sounds to total, stark deaf, from about the age of 28 to the age of about 46. This piece comes right around the middle. He had lost about half of his hearing. He had pretty much given up on going to doctors. He was, I wouldn't say resigned to his fate. He did contemplate suicide very seriously in one period of his life, but obviously he chose to to do something, and this piece is his response to that. So that fate knocking on the door represents his deafness. And I want to show you one place where that four-note dum, that relentless figure of music, finally goes away in a very sad, sweet way. Later on in that movement, he has the big beginning comes back again. And that first melody comes in that has all those da-da-da-da. But then, everybody stops, and the sad little oboe all alone, sad little oboe thing. You don't hear that da-da-dum at all. It's the only place in the whole 8-minute, 10-minute movement where you don't hear somebody somewhere going da-da-da-dum. Just very sad, and then it picks up again. The reason you have that there is that all through this piece, if Beethoven were in the audience listening to his symphony, he'd hear it the way you might hear it if you put your hands to your ears a little bit like that, you know. He'd hear it. It would be a little muffled. But that oboe solo, he would not hear. That would be silence, because that's what he lost first, high wind sounds, flutes, oboe. He could not hear that sound. So everywhere else, that da-da-da-dum is a kind of, I guess, a musical metaphor, a metaphor that represents his fate. But that oboe, that is his fate. There's no metaphor. That is his fate. He hears nothing. And so he doesn't need the motive there. Now, you may know this symphony, that first movement that I've been playing, very, very tumultuous and full of a kind of heroic kind of anger, like shaking your fist at God and saying, how did you do this to me? How could you possibly? It's filled with that kind of almost rage and emotion. But if you remember the piece, the last movement is all triumph and all optimism and all heroism. It sounds like Napoleon's troops have just marched into the country, and he has, in fact, now you have to imagine that I'm a band, a brass band, trumpets, trombones, and the last movement begins with this heroic, majestic theme. And really triumphant, really triumphant. Is the motive gone? Has he triumphed over his fate? The interesting thing, and this is where I think it connects to a very deep psychological truth. Back in his day, they used more spiritual language to talk about what we often talk about with psychological language. But, so you don't hear the motive at first. Yeah, that da-da-da-dum, you don't hear it. But then, ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum, 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 da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. And later on in the same movement, in another heroic melody, it comes back again. Da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. Da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. I think what Beethoven's getting at is that we don't find peace by ignoring our fate, by ignoring what's happened to us, by ignoring the bad stuff. We have to deal with it. We have to confront it, and we have to find some way to absorb it into how we live our lives, to recognize it, acknowledge it, and then find a way to triumph over it that way. You can't put it to the side. You can't ignore it. You can't forget about it. You can't say it never happened. You find some way to confront it. You find some way to absorb it. And you find some way to move on, as Beethoven did, writing his greatest music, maybe the greatest sort of pure music ever written, totally deaf. Isn't that an amazing image? That the greatest music ever written was written by a man who couldn't hear it. but heard it all inside his head. It's unfathomable. It's hard to imagine how he could hear that in his head and bring it out for the world. The Ninth Symphony, that great triumphant ode to joy, written when he was totally deaf. So I think this piece makes a very deep psychological or spiritual point about how we confront our fate, how we confront bad things that happen to all of us, and find some way to incorporate it, to accept it in some way, to deal with it, and to move on. So I thought that would be a very interesting thing from the point of view of Mr. Beethoven and what he has to teach us. Let me go on to my second burning question, which has to do with a composer I respect a lot, my favorite American composer, and I don't know if he's going to be up here. Let's see. Do we have slides for this one? Don't really need it that much, but... Oh, there he is. Is that it? Oh, they're up there. Oh, fair enough. Very good, very good. There's George Gershwin. There's a nice photo of... Oh, I can see that very nicely. Okay, there's George with his characteristic optimistic quality. There he is right there on the cover of Time magazine. Both George and Time magazine were very young at the time. There's George with his receding hairline in his 30s. There's on the right. There he is with his brother Ira, who wrote most of the words to his famous songs. Well, George Gershwin, I want to take you back to February 12th, 1924. It's a snowy afternoon in New York City, and there's going to be a concert in a hall that no longer exists, Aeolian Hall. And it's being produced by a very famous musician in the day, more famous than George was at the time, Paul Whiteman. And Paul Whiteman was sponsoring this as a concert of new American music, featuring a new composition by that wonderful songwriter, young songwriter, George Gershwin. Now, Gershwin was 25 years old. He had some reputation. He wasn't famous yet, but he was a young man in a hurry. He had already written a number of hit songs, but he had not yet written a full Broadway musical that he was about to do, in fact, that same year, with his brother Ira. He was born in New York City, 1898. He was a hyperactive kid, all kinds of problems with George. He wouldn't sit down in school. He wouldn't listen to the teachers. The teachers would say to him, Mrs. Gershwin, why can't George be a good boy like his brother Ira, his older brother Ira? Ira was such a good boy. You know those families? There's the good son and there's the bad son. And George was the bad son. He dropped out of high school at the age of 15, and he went to work in the music business right away. He had found the piano, and he was a good pianist and wanted to compose songs. That was the only thing that interested him at the time. And he got odd jobs here and there. And by the time he was 20, he had one hit song, a song called Swanee. And then by the time he was this age, 25, he had met Paul Whiteman, and they talked about, what about music? What about a bigger piece? I'm writing all these songs, they're 3 minutes long, that's great. And George was part of a terrific group of young songwriters that reinvented the American song and started writing what we now call the Great American Songbook. Such people as Irving Berlin, you may know, who wrote White Christmas and God Bless America, among so many others. Richard Rodgers, who wrote Oklahoma and Carousel. There's a lot of these wonderful songwriters, and George was one of them. But unlike the others, he had ambitions to write a larger piece, something that would be 10, 11, 12 minutes long, that would try to somehow capture some aspect, some element of the American experience. And believe it or not, nobody had tried to do that. There are certainly American poets, American painters, American novels that tried to grapple with this strange new country of America in the 19th century. But if you were to rack your brains, and even musicians say, oh, who are the great American symphonists that wrote these wonderful symphonies in the 19th century that would be somehow about this new strange country of the United States? I'd be very surprised if anybody would know any name. I barely know one or two names, and that isn't what they tried to do. There was a real reluctance. There was such a split between highbrow, so-called serious music that was seen, it had to be European. It had to be from Europe. Young Americans would go to Germany to study, and they'd come back writing music that made them sound like very bad Brahms or Wagner or something like that. And George had this image, and this was his vision. So here I want to show you this vision of his. This is an amazing statement, I think, and this comes from when he was 26 years old, a letter to a friend. He says, what am I trying to do in my larger pieces? I'd like to write of the melting pot of New York City itself, and think of New York City as a kind of microcosm of the United States, with its blend of native and immigrant strains. Now, as I mentioned, nobody had tried to do that. Even when a great European composer, Antonin Dvorak, came to the United States and gave a lecture saying, you have these wonderful Negro spirituals. Why don't you use them inside your symphonies the way I use Czech, Bohemian and Czech folk songs in my symphonies, the way Tchaikovsky uses Russian songs in his symphonies, creates a kind of bridge between popular music, folk music, and so-called serious music. American composers said, no, wouldn't work. Mostly racist reasons. That's not really you. That music, please. And so Gershwin says, this would allow for many kinds of music, black and white. So he realizes that there's something about African American music that is fundamental to what it means to be an American in musical terms, in every term, music as a metaphor for society. That there was something about that experience that had to be incorporated into anything that would be seen as truly American, black and white, Eastern and Western. And by Eastern, he meant Eastern European. He didn't mean Asian. He meant Eastern European, his people, mostly Jews, but people from Russia, people from Poland. A lot of those songwriters were coming, their parents had come from Russia, their parents had come from Poland, or so, and they came to New York City, and so he's talking about his own people and the music, all these new Broadway song type things. Western, of course, the great Western tradition of classical music. And this would call for a style that should achieve out of this diversity an artistic unity. That's the heart of it, and it's an amazing statement, I think. It sounds very modern. You know, at the beginning he talks about the melting pot. That term went out of fashion a while ago. But the idea of achieving unity out of diversity is at the heart of one strand of American thinking. Now, obviously, we're going through a period in the United States where this is up for question, where the whole notion of what diversity means as a force for good, as a positive thing, as an idea that binds us together into one of our Latin mottos, e pluribus unum, from many one, but creating some sense of unity in the country through recognizing diversity. That I would have thought 5 years ago that was more accepted, and apparently it is today in the United States. This is still a battle. This is still a battle we're fighting, and this is one important strand of that. So Gershwin is saying we want to achieve an artistic unity out of this diversity. New York is a meeting place, a rendezvous of the nations, and so on. So let's see what that means for him. Now, already in the 1920s, just as today, there are many different kinds of popular music. There's music that young people listen to, old people listen to. There's music Hispanics listen to, black people listen to, white people listen to. There's just a large country music. There's a large range of popular musics. Which one is America's popular music? Gershwin would say, all of them. They're all American popular music. And so what he did was he went to a number of these styles that already existed, but were listened to by very different people. So in those days, the blues, which is now very popular, you can go to Japan and walk into the House of Blues and hear the blues. But back in the 1920s, the blues was only recorded and sold as records and listened to in African American neighborhoods. It was really not well known among the larger white audience. Gershwin knew about it. The blues. Latin music, I'll get to that. Ragtime, which was the only style that did in fact appeal to both black and white. And the Broadway ballad, the new love songs that were being written by him and Jerome Kern and Richard Rodgers and Irving Berlin, this new style of love song that was coming in, that was mostly listened to by upper middle class white audiences that had the money to go to Broadway. So these are 4 separate styles of music that existed separately, different audiences. He's going to try to put them together to show unity, some kind of unity, amid all this cultural diversity. Let's see if I can give you a sense of that. So, for example, the very beginning of the piece that's the blues section, and you'll hear that a few times. You'll hear that blues number a few times. The Latin or Hispanic thing, this is an audience that I don't have to talk too much about this, but he takes that rhythm that is very characteristic. It's one of the characteristic rhythms from the Caribbean and Mexico and Cuba and all that. Bum, 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 bum. Just long, long, short, long, long, short. And in Rhapsody in Blue, ragtime is a style that is a combination of the European march, and the left hand of ragtime is almost always a very obvious march. Here's not by Gershwin, a ragtime left hand. So you hear the march, but the right hand kind of fights with it and comes in between the march notes and kind of in a pleasant way fights against the steady rhythm. This is Europe. This is Africa. The off rhythms, the love of complicated rhythms. In Rhapsody in Blue, here is the ragtime thing. You hear the march, right? And that's the third element, and the fourth one is the most famous one. United Airlines paid $500,000 to use the love song. It's the famous melody from Rhapsody in Blue is, of course, a Broadway love song without words. So I won't demonstrate that, but I will try to play a chunk of Rhapsody in Blue for you and give you a sense of how it flows from one melody into the other. So here's a bit of Rhapsody in Blue. And you can follow along. It'll be very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.